which is called Aid to Politics, Power and Safeguarding in International Aid. I'm Emily Jones, I'm an associate professor here at the school, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome all our panel. We've got a really distinguished panel of experts here this evening to discuss what's a really important and topical issue. So it's great that you're all here. We're live streaming, and it'll be on YouTube, the event afterwards, so we'll use mics, but just to be aware that for everyone that that's the case. Just by a bit of context, I'm sure you've all seen the recent headlines and allegations of sexual misconduct in the aid sector, which raised a lot of questions, important headlines. I think on reflection, what we thought at the School of Government here has been that there's been a less discussion about the organisational and policy steps that might be taken to better promote accountability and prevent and deter misconduct. So that's what we thought we'd do, is convene this panel of people to reflect on really the origins and the type of problems that we're dealing with, but also really take us towards some of the solutions and the organisational and policy steps that might want to be taken. And just by way of process, this is obviously a really important issue. It's also a profoundly personal issue for many people. So to ask us all to be therefore very respectful in our discussions tonight, and to recognise that the nature of what we're talking about. I've asked each of our speakers to speak for 5, maximum 7 minutes, and I'm going to be quite disciplined as chair. I'm going to introduce them all now, and they're going to speak in this order, and then we're going to open up for questions. So please do, as our speakers are making their comments, please do think of questions that you'd like to pose to the panel afterwards. So Asmita Naik will start our discussion with tonight. Asmita co-authored a report back in 2002 for the UNHCR and Save the Children on sexual exploitation in the aid sector. And I know for her it's sort of a déjà vu seeing this all again, so she's going to speak to some of those issues. She'll be followed by Helen Evans, who is Global Head of Safeguarding at Oxfam GB until 2015, and she's spoken out recently about this in the Times and elsewhere. Helen's also been chair of Oxford's Rape Crisis Centre and is now a county councillor here in Oxford City. So welcome. Steve Reeves is the Director of Child Safeguarding at Save the Children, the world's largest independent children's charity, and has worked extensively in this field on safeguarding and prevention of child sexual abuse. So welcome, Steve. Marcia Henry, who is the Deputy Director of the Centre for Women, Peace and Security, and Associate Professor in the Department of Gender Studies at London School of Economics and Political Science, and has been working for many years on this, in particular around UN peacekeeping. And we'll speak to some of those issues. And Shaista Aziz, a journalist and writer and former international aid worker who's worked as a broadcast journalist, producer for the BBC and a media specialist for Oxfam, and has also written following the Oxfam revelations in The Guardian. And it doesn't say it here, but I know you're a stand-up comedian too, Shaista, in your spare time. So, absolutely. So without further ado, may I hand over to you, Asmita?
Yes, thank you, Emily, and thank you for convening this really important forum. The past few weeks have really brought back a strong sense of déjà vu for me. In 2001, I was working in UNHCR in Geneva, and in the course of that, I went on mission to West Africa with some colleagues from Save the Children to carry out a study in the refugee camps. And very unexpectedly, we were very shocked to find during the course of this broader study that we were carrying out that widespread sexual exploitation of refugee children was occurring in the camps across all 3 countries. We documented allegations involving 67 individuals, 40 aid agencies, many of them household names, and 9 peacekeeping battalions. The exploitation often involved transacting aid for sex with children in terms of exchanging bars of soap, tarpaulin sheets, biscuits, a few meagre pennies. Most of the victims were children under 18 years of age, and the consequences on their lives were dramatic in terms of the health consequences, STDs, unwanted pregnancies, emotional abuse and consequences, and social exclusion. The findings were truly shocking, and they led to a media and public outcry. And donors, in particular, were outraged enough to mobilise in order to force global policy-level change. So this was the first time there was global policy on this issue. Until that point, it it was something that was talked about, rumoured about, there were anecdotal accounts, but this was the first time that the agenda was moved to set in place some policies and procedures. At the very high level, there was a General Assembly resolution. The UN Secretary-General issued a bulletin which set the system-wide policy on the issue. The Interagency Standing Committee convened a working group on sexual exploitation and abuse, which continues in a reform structure today, which set about developing codes of conduct and policies and procedures. And there are also NGO initiatives, such as the Building Safer Organisations project under ICFA, and also the Humanitarian Accountability Partnership and its successor, CHS Alliance. Both of those address this issue as well. Clearly, this high-level policy change was very necessary. You know, the infrastructure was needed in order to address this issue. But what we see from the recent scandal is that implementation is sorely lacking. And so what is needed now to push forward further action on this issue? I would emphasise three things. Firstly, there's a need for greater transparency and ownership by the aid community of this issue. The secrecy that this subject is shrouded in is highly damaging and is preventing this issue from being addressed. Needless to say, the secrecy surrounding this oppresses victims, survivors, whistleblowers, those who want to report, and witnesses. Secondly, the zero tolerance policy that is adopted at the highest levels actually needs to be enforced. And this means that at every management level, there has to be a responsibility to pass down messages about what kinds of behaviour are acceptable. And where violations occur, there needs to be robust action which has consequences for those who violate these codes. And thirdly, and most importantly, there is a dire need for external oversight of this issue. I called for that way back in 2002, being a first-hand observer of the way these international organisations responded and the difficulty that even donor governments had to hold them to account, made it clear to me, even at that time, that only an external entity, for instance, an ombudsman, could truly hold international aid agencies to account in the way that is deserved by beneficiaries and taxpayers. And so what we see now, in 16 years later, the aid sector has had plenty of time to put itself in order and to show that it can tackle this issue itself. And the recent revelations, which are really just the tip of the iceberg, show me that implementation is still far off. And I really believe the time has come for donors to lead on setting up a global ombudsman for the beneficiaries of development and humanitarian aid. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Ending there with this thought about a global ombudsman, which I know is something that Helen's been thinking about a lot about as well. Helen, over to you.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. So just to begin, I believe in the aid sector, and I believe the majority of aid workers act with integrity. I also know a minority abuse the privileged position of power and trust they have with beneficiaries, and that to date the sector has not done enough. I'm going to tell you today about my experiences as Oxfam's head of safeguarding until 2015, what happened after I left, and my thoughts about the changes now needed. Before I do, though, it's important to acknowledge the points Esmita's made. This isn't new. Back in 2002, the systemic nature of abuse was exposed, with 48 agencies implicated in the abuse, and many, many children hurt and abused across Western Africa. At that time, we had high-level commitments from the UN and aid agencies to tackle this issue. Policies were written, task forces established, training given, and yet here we are, 15 years later, facing the same revelations. I became Oxfam's head of safeguarding in 2012 after 4 years with Oxfam. I applied in the wake of the Haiti investigation and was hopeful that this role could help move the organisation forward as it strengthened efforts to tackle sexual abuse. Looking back on lessons learned from 2002, I knew it would not be enough to just have a policy and training and a reactive approach to complaints. We needed to do something different. And whilst this had been called for before, we now had an opportunity to push for this change. Drawing on learning from our security risk management strategy, I conducted an audit of Oxfam's safeguarding risk management framework. This included governance, policy plans and procedures, systems, resourcing, training and monitoring and evaluation. Governance and resourcing were identified as two particularly weak areas, so my first step was to establish a safeguarding steering group, bringing together programme, HR and audit with a director-level lead and trustee reporting. The second was to establish a global network of women's safeguarding focal points to lead outreach on this issue. Drawing on learning from the rape crisis sector, I knew that those who suffered abuse would mostly be women and children, and the perpetrators would mostly, but not always, be men in positions of power. For this reason, men could be a barrier to reporting, and it was essential to have a woman focal point in each country. In addition, for people to access support, the support needed to be survivor-focused. The priority of the focal points needed to be on meeting that person's immediate needs, whether physical or emotional, and that as a secondary concern we should explore in whether they wanted to report or not, and if they did, what that would involve. In tandem, we also trained a team of specialist investigators, moving away from a model that relied on generic investigators from HR and counter-fraud, and began hosting women-only groups, providing safe spaces for women to discuss the abuse they're experiencing. Whilst women might not feel comfortable disclosing individually, as a group, confidence could be built to disclose. As a result of these and other efforts, reporting more than doubled, with 39 reports in 2013-14 and 95% investigated reports either fully or partially upheld. Drawing on learning from rape crisis, we suspected that underreporting was likely to be significant. And in response, we began inviting people to complete confidential questionnaires to get a better understanding of the levels of underreporting. And it was at this point the full scale of abuse became apparent. At the end of 2014, I submitted a report to the Oxfam leadership team disclosing that of 120 people surveyed, over 1 in 10 were saying they'd witnessed or experienced sexual abuse perpetrated by Oxfam workers. And in one country, 7% were saying they'd witnessed or experienced rape. And the worst thing in all of this, the people surveyed were our own staff. So if this abuse was taking place within our offices, we could only imagine the scale of abuse taking place when our workers were out in the field. It is at this point that my account and Oxfam's differs. I'm not going to go into detail about this, as this is the subject of an ongoing Charity Commission investigation, but suffice to say, I felt Oxfam's response was not sufficient and felt unable to continue in my post after raising concerns with the leadership team and trustees. I went on to take my concerns to the Charity Commission, and whilst they investigated in 2015, they did not ask to meet with me or ask me any follow-up questions. I then took my concerns to my MP, and still there was no traction as he raised those concerns with government. Sadly, it wasn't until the Times picked up this story after another whistleblower went to them that there was any interest. It shouldn't have been the case that it needed media involvement before there was action. So looking ahead, what lessons can we draw? What more can we do? First and foremost, what we do now cannot be the same as we did 15 years ago. It is not enough to say we need to strengthen governance practices within charities. Yes, good governance is essential, but as recent events have shown, self-regulation does not work. I would echo Smita's calls for an international ombudsman. We need an independent organisation that people can turn to when they can't get resolution from within an agency. And that organisation needs to have the funding required to do its job properly and the powers to effect change when aid agencies aren't taking the action needed. We also need an international hub, pooling specialist resources that aid agencies can access. There is also a pivotal role for donors like DFID. This includes mandating aid agencies to evidence safe design in their programmes, to have a minimum spend on safeguarding activities, to require funded groups to report annually on safeguarding incidents, and to convene an annual safeguarding conference to share and shape best practice. And importantly, to commission work with survivors to ensure their voice is heard as we define best practice to prevent, detect, and respond to abuse. I also believe there are important changes to be made here in the UK. Personally, I don't think the Charity Commission is best placed to regulate UK-based agencies. Aid agencies like Oxfam and Save the Children have incomes of excess of 100 million. They operate in globally high-risk contexts. It doesn't make sense for a regulator that predominantly deals with smaller UK-focused charities to regulate these activities. I believe the UK needs a dedicated regulator for aid agencies. I also believe aid agencies should have a board-level, independent safeguarding advisor who provides trustees with expert advice. And they should be required in their annual return to give an explicit assurance that they have confidence in their safeguarding practices, and for this assurance to be given with independent external assessment. In summary, there are many changes we could make to strengthen safeguarding practices in the aid sector. What we must do is ensure that we do not have a repeat of what happened in 2002. We had a lot of promises, a lot of strong words, but ultimately little tangible change. We need sustainable, long-term change. We need deeds, not words. We need to do everything within our power to ensure 15 years from now we are not having the same discussion.
Thank you very much, Helen. Steve, let me turn to you, because I know this is very much on your day-to-day, your desk job, right, for SAVE. So what are your thoughts on these issues?
Yes, so I guess, thank you for convening this. So I guess I'm the first remaining representative of a large NGO. So I left our office this afternoon to come up and talk to you. And we live in this really disturbing time if you're a representative of an international aid agency. So we're in a context where the need for our services, our programs are greater than ever. We're seeing more and more protracted, more deeply concerning conflicts and humanitarian situations developing year on year. And yet we're also in this really strange situation where people need our services, they need us to be there, and yet actually when we start to dig into some of these issues, we discover that potentially the wrong people are there and doing the wrong sort of things. And so I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which the sector itself is struggling with coming to terms with where it finds itself. Whether or not that's a reasonable response, having had warnings in the past, I don't know, but that's something maybe that we'll talk about. I think what's really interesting, my career began, and I've spent most of my career in the UK safeguarding sector. And what's really frustrating about that, and we see echoes of that in the international sector, is that we only learn about protecting children in my specialist area through dismal failure. So if we're in the UK context, we have cases like Victoria Climbié, we have cases like Baby P, and we do inquiries and we vow it'll never happen again, and we all get some activity around some of those things. And actually we see consistent outcomes on those things. The same sorts of things come out of those inquiries consistently. And yet, if you look at those two cases in the UK, Victoria Climbié and Baby P, Peter Connolly, happen in the same local authority area, only a few years apart, with the same lessons to be learnt. And I think that's the big challenge for us, actually. How do we stop this situation being one that just passes us by? And we're in this broader context, aren't we? So in the UK, over the last few years, we've had the launch of the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. And so day to day, we're seeing more and more about the sexual abuse of children. And what's really interesting to me, the echoes for the domestic context. So when Theresa May, when she was Home Secretary, launched that inquiry, and I looked down at my notes just to make sure it's accurate. What she said was that the general public failed to appreciate the extent and the depth of the exploitation of children, particularly in that context. And that at the end of this inquiry, people won't be able to look at society in the same way again. And actually, I think what's really disturbing is that we have all of these warnings presented to us. And we've heard about the warnings from 2002. And actually, we shouldn't be surprised about those things. And actually, we do need to reconcile ourselves to the new future, if you like. You know, actually, this is the new normal in terms of the way in which we need to look at some of these things. There's several observations people have made in the media and more broadly about this sort of crisis that we've experienced over the last few months. Interestingly, of course, that we refer to it as a crisis because the media got hold of it as opposed to the foundation of the issues that the media are reporting. And we should say that we're grateful to the media, really, in bringing this to broader public attention. But that's no excuse for people in the agency, in the sector, who should have been tackling these things. But this observation about powerful men being in control of access to resources, particularly in life-changing situations, is really profound, and we need to work out how we reconcile that with the way in which we run organisations and governments operate and what have you. So we shouldn't deny that at all. It's also very clear that we've had the cases that have come to public attention have largely been around the exploitation of adult women, either in the workplace or in field locations. And the term safeguarding has actually become this very broad term that seems to encompass everything from sexual harassment in the workplace to the rape of women and children in the field. And actually, that's quite useful shorthand in the media, but actually it's quite problematic in terms of understanding how we might resolve some of these situations. I probably should draw to a close, really, but I think there's a really interesting thing about the sector, and I agree with Helen. The overwhelming majority of aid workers are amazingly impressive individuals who run the wrong way into earthquakes and all sorts of things. And in that body of people, there will be a group of people who will never exploit their positions, will never exploit that position of trust in which they've been placed. There regrettably will be a group of people who will always look for an opportunity to do that, and we need to focus some attention on how do we ensure that those people don't get into the workforce, and if they do, we detect them, we follow up reports, and we exit them from the organisations in which they work. We ensure they don't work anywhere else, and they're held to account by state actors where that's possible. I think what's really interesting is this body of people in the middle who we don't know how large that is, but actually might exploit their position given certain circumstances. And I don't think we understand enough around how that might work. And so one of the things that no doubt we'll talk about is what this global entity might look like that holds aid agencies to account, and where there might be a slight difference of opinion amongst people sitting here is, I believe really strongly that that needs to be a research-led piece that actually helps us understand more about how this problem manifests itself and how it can be resolved. But absolutely, we should make no mistake that this is a generational challenge for us, in the same way as tackling child exploitation and abuse in the UK has been more than a generational challenge, and we thought in the 80s we were discovering sexual abuse actively then, and actually now we're having a public inquiry into sexual abuse because it turns out all of those bold things that we did in the 80s and 90s didn't quite get us to where we need to be. And so I think one of the reasons why evenings like this are so critical actually is that there's a real risk that this disappears into the ether in the way that previous crises have. And it's incumbent on all of us who have an interest in this, the general public as well in terms of taxpayers, make sure that doesn't happen. And on behalf of those members of the sector that I speak to regularly, people are waiting to be held to account. Actually, this is not something where the sector is hoping it goes away. When I speak to senior leaders in NGOs, they don't want this to go away. They want this problem to be solved. And I think evenings like this are part of resolving that.
Great, thank you very much. You set us on a very sort of constructive note there for thinking about solutions to this and how we keep the momentum going. Marcia, you've been sitting in academia and sort of thinking, Steve mentioned the importance of research and seeing sort of stepping back from this.
Yes.
Your research on the UN and other.
Yeah, I mean, most of my research has been, it was very much influenced by reading Asmita's report, actually. We started to think, myself and another colleague at the time, what kind of research could we do to examine what's going on the ground, especially because those first reports, although they pointed to aid workers more generally, and although the study that was conducted actually had over 40 aid agencies, in a way the media took up very much the peacekeepers, and in some ways the global governance institutions like the UN responded to the peacekeeper element of it, and we ended up, in a sense, I think, segregating those groups of those individuals and those groups of people in the humanitarian space. But I'm feeling a bit better about the fact that the research I've done and many others have done has been systematically ignored over time, because I see that, actually the individuals who've been working on the ground, who've been working at various levels of governance, have had their thoughts, their ideas, their recommendations ignored for quite a long time. So I'm feeling a bit better, and I'm about that. I mean, one of the things that keeps coming up, I think, in particular, is around training of peacekeepers. And I think that there's been a lot of responses which, are clearly that training in general will not improve this situation. You need, which is clear from what everyone else has said, you need a multi-level approach to responding. But if we think about what is involved in training, we might be able to, potentially, I think, potentially make a contribution, or just think about what the general ethos and ideas are that come out of training. So I've been really interested in the development of, very recently, August 2017, the UN has released publicly, so anybody who's interested in this, you can Google search it and look up Military Aid Memoir. And this is a document that is given to peacekeepers, and when I say peacekeepers, that includes civilian personnel, police personnel, and military personnel. And it's a kind of guidebook around sexual exploitation and abuse in particular. And in the memoir, which is not that long, but it's long enough that it may put some people off of reading it, there is one double-sided card that comes with it, and that's a kind of a card that peacekeepers can carry around, which has a couple of different points, just kind of reminding peacekeepers what constitutes sexual exploitation and abuse. And I think it's, in a way, a very interesting and simple way to convey messages. On the other hand, it's very worrying that we are still, expecting that people have to carry around essentially a reminder not to rape, not to commit sexual harassment. This is also treating our peacekeepers, not in a very professional manner. So we're not really holding, it's only one aspect of the memoir. But when you look through the memoir, you'll see that there are lots of problematic representations. There's mostly men depicted in the images, the photographs. It tends to treat sexual exploitation and abuse as really about behavior rather than part of organizational culture. So that element is still very weak, despite the fact that these reports, as early as 2002, have been talking about the wider social context within which these incidents of sexual violence are taking place. So there still isn't really, if you look at the documents, that still hasn't really come out. One of the key issues besides this, that again is very absent from this document and from larger training and discussions, I think, is the issue of power. So although the specific conduct policy says the reason that peacekeepers should not be involved in relationships with local individuals is because there is a significant power imbalance between them. And one of the examples they use is that peacekeepers can leave the mission and local people cannot as easily. And I think that's a really good initiative. That's been very positive. However, that's been the end of the discussion on power. And again, this treats peacekeepers and local individuals as if they are really simple humans that cannot actually manage to have this sustained discussion. So I think that training really needs to involve much deeper discussions about what does the exercise of power mean? And I think peacekeepers need to be introduced to the concepts of victimization or victimhood, and also what does agency look like? What does it mean for a local person to have agency? And this can be quite complex discussions, because it may be that individual women, for example, have some agency in relation to pursuing aspects of economic security, but the overall situation in which they're living has so many other intersecting inequalities that it's not just simply a matter of, rectifying someone's economic situation in the short term. So really detailed and complex discussions actually are not going to hurt peacekeepers or local people. We actually need to get in depth. And again, one approach might be to incorporate into training wider, discussions about wider social inequalities, discussions about patriarchy, intersectionality, colonialism, and really, if we're going to talk about safeguarding, why not have a discussion? What is safeguarding? Why should not professionals in the field be discussing what are the contours of safeguarding? What should be our obligation to safeguarding? This actually, I think, links with the sort of second point that I wanted to make, which is really about gender parity and gender equality. Now, I think some of the issues that were raised in those early reports were around, how do you expect individuals, I think this is less so in the humanitarian aid sector, but definitely in the peacekeeping community, how can peacekeepers reform their practices? How can they act ethically in a context where they see gender inequality all around them? So if you are a male peacekeeper, you're in a very male-dominated environment. You don't see women in your battalion, in your platoon. You're not seeing women in positions of leadership, in positions of power. So how are you going to, how is that your ideas about gender going to be transformed if you visually, just simply do not see that gender equality around you? And of course, gender equality in this context is more than empowerment. It's also about, and this I think is very key, it's also about recognizing and giving up privilege. So Steve, you were talking about the power of men in these, and I think it's not just about empowering women and convincing women to go on peacekeeping missions. We also need to think very much about what does it mean to give up privilege in these contexts. And again, I've seen this over and over again, and Shaista will be bored to death of seeing my constant tweets about this, but we really have to move away. It's so crucial from this instrumentalist view that if we just add women into this situation, that somehow this will resolve all of these incidents of violence, these practices. It will not improve effectiveness if there is no commitment to gender equality. That's my feeling. And also, I think the idea that, if peacekeepers see around them that female colleagues have just as much an equal opportunity to and an equal share of the remuneration for national service, I think that's a key element that, it's not just that women will improve the conditions of peace, it's that they actually have an equal right to be part of that sector. And then maybe just more controversially to end on this point, in the training there is one of the main messages that comes out of the policy documents and the short training for peacekeepers is that because of the situation of inequality between peacekeepers and local population, consent is not really important. And I think when this was devised, this was really important. This was a major breakthrough because it was sort of saying, look, this environment is filled with inequalities. It's filled with individuals who are traumatized. It's the landscape that people are embedded in is one of a post-war situation. So this is really an unusual setting. However, and so that in that sense, consent doesn't matter. It's just prohibited. Sexual exploitation and abuse, all forms of sexual interaction with local people is prohibited. But I think that sent a bad message to peacekeepers because it didn't teach peacekeepers about the importance of consent. And I think that has been reflected also in the cases of sexual harassment, sexual intimidation amongst peacekeepers and amongst the few female peacekeepers that are actually there. Incredibly difficult for female peacekeepers when they're such small numbers to whistleblow, to challenge the command structure, incredibly difficult. And I was just thinking of the very simple example of the conduct and discipline units in a peacekeeping mission. How could you walk up to that door of that office? Everybody would see you You know, it's just the whole situation of how you could go about reporting. So I'm a huge fan of a independent body, because this is just, it's not possible in these settings. It's a highly gender-sensitive context. Great. And I think that the last thing I'll just say is really about frank discussions amongst peacekeepers are needed about sex work, about sexual health, about child abuse, about intimate partner violence. They don't actually know, many of the peacekeepers who are police officers do not, they are not familiar with these terms and definitions. So I think those things need to be introduced rather than, and I think that issue about secrecy is really important, that these issues need to be expanded and exposed. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you very much. I saw Shaista vigorously nodding at some points there about power, and I know your comment in The Guardian was sort of situating this in a much wider context of sort of bullying and harassment. And
and racism, So I'm coming at this from a slightly, similar angle, but kind of slightly different as well, in the sense that I want to talk about some of the women, mostly it has to be said women, who have been in touch and given myself and a group of current and former aid workers, we created a platform called NGO Safe Space, because what we wanted to do was to gather testimony from, as I said, mostly women, the ones who came forward, but there were some men, to give to the Women and Equalities Committee in Parliament, who are launching an inquiry into sexual harassment in the workplace. So that was our sort of framework for asking women, asking actually survivors and victims of sexual abuse in the aid sector to come forward. And in the space of 2.5 weeks, we had 95 plus submissions. So I think that tells us a lot, frankly. These submissions were mostly from women, but they were from some men as well. And they were all from individuals who work in the aid sector here in the UK. So this is just a tip of the iceberg. That expression was used at the start of the discussion. And what these submissions basically show is that most of the perpetrators are men. Most of the people who have suffered are women. In particular, there's a percentage of women who are women of colour and women with intersectional identities. And they are usually the least likely to talk, to speak about what's happened to them, because they're easily identifiable, because there's so few of them working in the headquarters of UK organisations. And this goes to the heart of a lot of these issues, which is around diversity. Everyone loves that word diversity. I prefer to use the word representation, because I think that's more accurate. And also, if you are a gay man, you are particularly vulnerable to abuse as well. And I think what we have at the moment is like the very beginnings of a movement, which the hashtag, as you all know, is Aid2. Some people can kind of say, well, this is just another flash in the pan moment, another hashtag. I'm here to say, no, it's not. I'm here to say very clearly that from the testimonies that we've received and from the discussions that we've been having with lots of survivors and victims, this is very much the tip of the iceberg. I wrote the piece for The Guardian, I think it was about 2 months ago now, and they asked if they could embed my email address into the piece. And rather foolishly, I said yes. I did it with full consent because I wanted individuals to reach out to me. I can tell you that for every day, for 3 weeks, I had at least 30 or 40 emails in my inbox from all over the world. I don't know who these people are. I can't tell you if I can, substantiate their stories. But what I can tell you is that they all had a story to tell, and they all wanted to be heard, and they all wanted to be believed. And I think at the heart of this is what this is about. If 95 plus people can submit anonymous testimony to go to Parliament and to an inquiry and give this testimony to women they've never met before, they've put their trust in us, then I do think that speaks volumes about what's going on. And I also think it goes to the heart of the issues in the aid sector, which is that for far too long, the aid sector has had this image where they're everyone's an angel of mercy, everyone is doing good work. And what I say to that is most people are doing good work. However, we need to understand that every sector, be it medicine, be it law, be it aid, is a reflection of the outside world. So how it's impossible to think that in all organisations you don't have homophobes and racists and Islamophobes and anti-Semites just because apparently they do good work. And I think this has been a kind of narrative that has been spun for far too long. The other thing that's come out of the last 2 very painful months for a lot of people is the accusations that have been put on women's shoulders. And as I said, I do keep saying this, mostly it is women, but men have also been subjected to abuse as well, is that these women's testimonies and these women's stories are aiding the attacks on aid. And basically there's a right-wing agenda against aid. I've heard this over and over and over again. I've spent 15 years, more than 15 years working in the aid sector. I've spent some of the best years of my life working in the sector. I've met some incredible people, some of the best and most professional people I've worked with. But I've also met some hardcore racists, some hardcore homophobes, and I've met a lot of misogynists. And these are facts. And I think the silencing of women is terrifying in this sector. And I know that's a big, broad statement to make, but I stand by this statement because we have had contact with so many women who've gone into great detail to explain how they've been silenced by management internally inside organisations. They've been silenced when they've gone to HR. They've been told over and over again that, you know, these types of incidences won't help the public, won't help when it comes to raising money, to fundraising, all this type of thing. And also whistleblowers. I mean, we have a brave whistleblower sitting on this panel. They've been vilified, you know, they've been attacked. And as I'm speaking now, there is actually a young man who's been outed. He says he's been outed by the Prime Minister's political secretary for being a whistleblower and for the allegations he's made against the Leave campaign. This man is a man of colour. He is a man of Pakistani heritage. And he says that his family's life is now in danger in Pakistan. And he is also at risk. And we all know that the whistleblower laws in our country have been watered down substantially. And we're living in very, very dangerous times when whistleblowers don't have protection. And in the case of this young man, the allegations that he's making in relation to how he's been outed are very, very serious. And I do see parallels there with the testimonies and the information that we've been gathering from women who feel terrified. And senior journalists as well, when they've been speaking to us, they've asked us questions like, why is X organisation or Z organisation operating like a cult? Why won't women come forward? And we say to them, well, because there's cultures inside these organisations, and the main culture is patriarchy, which exists absolutely everywhere. And at the heart of this is patriarchy and its power and its race. They're all entwined. And I think that we have to get very serious and very real and very realistic about pulling all of this apart. And to do that doesn't mean that you're an enemy of the aid sector, or you don't believe that there are aspects of aid or development that are good and that are, you know, need to be bolstered. That's not the case. But what we are saying very clearly is that we are not making any excuses for rape, for sexual violence, and for intimidation, and for racism, and for everything else. There's just no excuse for it. And I believe that this is a watershed moment for this sector. And I feel that at the heart of this, there has to be accountability. That is what everyone is seeking. Accountability for what has gone on and accountability to make sure it doesn't continue. And there's a revolving door, and we've heard about it. There's a revolving door that in these aid organisations, in many of these aid organisations, I should say, that allow most of the perpetrators who are men to just continue to the next job, the next job, and the next job. And I think now that some of this is out in the open, I think that there's greater scrutiny on the sector, but it's a travesty that it takes whistleblowers to do this. So the questions are, where are the checks and balances inside these organisations? Where are they? What was the Charity Commission doing? What were the other entities doing? These are serious questions that need to be asked on this.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm going to now open up to our audience. I know there's a lot of people in the room with a lot of experience in the sector. So I'm going to take 3 questions at a time. Please briefly introduce yourself, and then a succinct question. We'll come back to the panel, please. So I can see 2 questions on this side. Is there another question on this side? No?
Hello, I am Johannes. I hold a doctorate in education. I have carried out research in safeguarding and particularly focused on interprofessional working in safeguarding. Yeah, but regarding this issue, I really agree with the lady in pink. I think it's Helen. Yeah, in what you said, that we need to do something drastic. We need to do something new. And I also liked your indignation that we need to really fight for this. And I think actually from my point of view and my research, I think what we need to do is to work with these aid workers' integrity. And we need to work on a kind of psychodynamical level. Do these people which are being shipped out, do they actually have some underlying issues which are unresolved? And then I think also we need to work with these people's, in German we would say Bildung. So we need to work with their, yeah, with their mindset and with their societal.
Great. So kind of question about how really thinking about the psychology and the psychodynamics, the people that are going out into the field, and whether that's the type of intervention. Great, thank you, Elena.
Hi, I'm Liana. I'm currently studying at the Blavatnik school. I'm doing an MPP. My question is more of like a summary of what all of you have said. There is actually a bigger problem here, and I think Shaista pointed it out, is actually patriarchy. I think we've been focused too much on the survivors. We're not talking about the perpetrators. And there is this big thing about understanding privilege and also admitting to patriarchy, regardless of gender, regardless of sexuality. And we need to somehow think of this bigger question of how to educate people about consent, about sexual reproductive rights, not just in the aid sector, but overall, because this is just another hashtag. There is also hashtag #MeToo, hashtag #MosMeToo, that links back to the Islamophobia and racism that is kind of like given to the survivors when we tell of our stories. It's like you cannot tell this because you're painting a bad image for Muslims, you're painting a bad image for the aid sector.
So thinking then wider intervention, sort of.
Yeah, and I think we should focus more on the perpetrators. We've been talking too much about the survivors all these years.
Thank you. Yeah, let's get 2 more questions from, yeah.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm also an MPP student at the Blavatnik School of Government. I actually have 2 separate questions. The first question is that how can we be confident that we can have a credible and capable external ombudsman? They will be the same people, having the same culture. And so I'm actually quite skeptical about whether we can have a credible and capable external ombudsman. The second question is about consent. You talked about the some requirements is that the peacekeepers are not allowed to have sexual contacts whatsoever with local people. But in that sense, I'm only asking for argument's sake, not that I'm agreeing what I'm going to say. Are we denying the sexual rights of people in the war zone or in the disaster areas? So these are my 2 questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And then the lady next to you, and then we'll come back again for another round of questions after the panel's had a chance to respond.
Hi, thanks everyone for an incredible discussion. I'm Chloe. I'm writing a PhD in international development here. I have a gazillion questions, but I will just stick to one, probably quite annoying one. Marsha, you talked about the segregation of different kinds of sexual violence in conflict or emergency contexts that are often...
Can you speak up and a little quieter? Sorry, a little louder and a
I'll try. I'm not very good at projecting, but I'll try. Marsha talked about the segregation or separation of different kinds of sexual violence in conflict or emergency contexts that are often defined by the profile of the perpetrator, whether it be a peacekeeper or, armed groups that will look different to an aid worker, for instance. So I guess my question is, in this context, when we're talking about whether it be an international body or different accountability mechanisms, what are we talking about when we talk about accountability? What will those mechanisms look like, and for whom, I guess? Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So really important questions there about the solutions. Should we go back along the panel in the order that you spoke, and please speak to any of the questions that you would like to answer. Asmita.
Yes, I'd like to pick up on the Ombudsman point. I'm not that, sceptical about it working, because I'm basing these comments on the fact that we have ombudsmen in this country in a number of different sectors. And they provide an impartial and independent review of public services or private services. So we have local authority and social care ombudsman, we have ombudsman for the legal profession, for insurance companies. It's a function that is recognised. It's a function that works in different parts of the world. Obviously, there would be challenges in implementing it in this sector, and that's something that would need to be thought about. But speaking also from my own experience of sitting on some of these kind of similar kind of professional regulatory panels in this country, the systems that already exist, do result in credible and objective and reliable decision making.
Can I push it a little bit on us, Asmita? So the qualities of an ombudsman or independent regulator, what makes it work? Because we know there are also cases where they don't work. So what is it about the ones you've sat on that make them particularly effective?
I don't know what you're thinking of when you're thinking that they don't work. So, that could be quite a big subject. But clearly the independence of the function is the key part at all levels, in terms of the function itself, in terms of the people who are appointed there as decision makers. So, yes, I'm optimistic. And I think, this is it's the last chance saloon, to be honest, because everything else has been tried. Anything else that we try now or we suggest is really just going to be tinkering around the edges. So if we want to try a radical solution to address this, I believe it has to be an independent body, whatever you call it. Obviously, a lot of thought has to go into that. It's only a few voices like ours who are actually raising this issue. It's not as if policymakers have applied themselves to this. It's, the likes of us on this panel who as individuals have raised this and thought about it. So, there's a long way to go in terms of testing the feasibility, and I don't think we can speak to that. But I believe it's the only solution, and I believe we have to go for it now. 16 years on, I think that's ample time to see if anything else worked, and now we know it didn't work. Yeah. The second point on the psychology of perpetrators and so on, the thing I'd like to point out is that the perpetrators come in many different shapes and guises and forms. So we're talking sometimes about, international aid workers, sometimes we're talking about locally recruited staff. We're talking about a wide variety, but the thing that I've observed from my own field experience, I think it's and not just in refugee camps. I think this can apply in other settings in the UK context as well. It's about, if you allow the conditions to flourish, if you allow opportunities to arise, some of this will undoubtedly kind of opportunistic exploitation. And so this is where, the systems and the standards and the implementation and the enforcement of codes of conduct and punishment for violations of those is really important.
So we have the code, which is your point earlier, we're not implementing them and we're not enforcing them properly.
Oh yes, there are plenty of codes like that, because now codes are ubiquitous and in agencies since 2002 everyone has them, and most of the codes do address these key heinous behaviours that we're talking about, trading sex for aid with a child. It's quite clear cut, but the problem is the lack of enforcement and the lack of penalisation of people who violate.
Helen?
Some really good questions. So first of all, in terms of the psychology, I think I've been thinking a lot about the organisational psychology. So what stopped senior management engaging and responding adequately? And I think someone once described this to me and said, what you are finding out about is the dark side of the aid agency. And when you're going out into war-torn countries and putting yourself at risk, you're doing it because you believe you're doing something good and making a difference. And to engage with the psychology of, actually we could be doing harm, I think is really, really difficult. And I think we have to look at how do we, analyse that and think what can we do to ensure that people can engage, because they've got to engage, because if we don't, we're not going to see the change that we need. In terms of the perpetrators, and a comment you made there about we've heard from the survivors, we haven't. Like in the press, you know, we've had people like myself, whistleblowers, people who've written reports, like Asmita. Actually, those voices are not being heard because it is just impossible. When you've been abused in a refugee camp and your life's very transient and you're under huge risk of speaking out, those voices aren't heard. So actually, I think we need to do even more to make sure those survivor voices are heard. And we've got the Safeguarding Summit in the autumn that the government are convening, and something I'm calling for is survivors need to be at that conference, or we need to find a way of facilitating their voice to be heard, because we ultimately have got to be accountable to them. But I do take your point in terms of we need to do more to understand perpetrators and to look at, because if we understand what's going on, we can then better detect and prevent. So I think that is an important call. And in terms of the independence of an ombudsman, I think at the heart of this, we need to engage whistleblowers, survivors, safeguarding practitioners. So one of the things I've been talking to government about is the Safeguarding Summit that was held was just full of chief executives. And yet people are coming forward and saying that's the problem. You know, that's the reason why things haven't been acted on in recent years. So actually, if we're going to shape a solution and shape an independent body that's going to be effective, we need to have whistleblowers and survivors involved in that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think just in terms of accountability, you know, I think there's three facets to it. The first one is prevention, the second one is detection, and then it's response. And, you know, where are the prosecutions? There are people here who've been breaking a number of international laws in terms of the prevalence of sexual exploitation and abuse, but you know, who's being prosecuted for this? They're not. And that's something as well I think we need to do more of in terms of with prosecuting bodies to look at how can we truly hold people accountable, because until people are actually being prosecuted for this, where's the deterrence?
Steve?
Yeah, so to go in order really, I think this is a really important point about perpetrator behaviour, and I think it's something that we're deeply lacking in our understanding of. So most of the work that we do in the UK and around the world in terms of safer recruitment and understanding the way sexual abuse, particularly of children, occurs, is based on research that was done decades ago in North America. It's never been normed outside of North America at all. And actually, we're now spending hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to apply lessons from New Hampshire in the US to South Sudan, and then we're shocked that it doesn't work. And actually, we need to find a way of understanding more about the context in which we're working. And I think the behaviour and insights from the behaviour of perpetrators has to play a really significant part in that. And I would never want to silence victims or survivors by any stretch of the imagination. But what I think is really interesting when you actually do behaviour analysis style work with perpetrators is they see a much broader picture than a victim. And that's really difficult for those of us that want to be victim-focused to accept. But actually, a perpetrator knows when they start a process of grooming that that's what they're doing. And actually, they can see the weaknesses in organisations that actually, if you're a victim or a survivor, that's really difficult to do because you just find yourself on the receiving end of heinous behaviour. Whereas actually, there are a subset of people that engage in this sort of behaviour who are absolutely calculating, manipulative individuals who join the sector solely for the purpose of engaging in that sort of behaviour. And what we're doing consistently is bringing to bear knowledge that we've generated from research with geography teachers in the UK to try and apply it to aid workers in some of the most challenging contexts in the world. And actually, we're making a leap that research holds true. And I'm not sure that's a sound thing for us to do, actually. And so one of the proposals we've made to DFID, actually, is that as part of this global centre, whatever it might look like, is that they should fund a small behaviour analysis unit that might just focus on some of this work to try and establish what is it about people that run the wrong way into a conflict like Syria to sexually abuse children or sexually assault women that makes them different to the person who could do it in the Sunday school or the Scout group or the football club at home. It's possible that there's nothing to learn there, but it just seems implausible that there's not something special to learn.
Both the psychology and the psychodynamic profiling of the perpetrator, but also the weaknesses in the organisation.
Absolutely.
And sort of so can you elaborate a little bit on that? What is it that makes an organisation more weak or one that's more resilient?
Well, and I think there's a number of aspects to that. And so actually what tends to happen is we rely on this safer recruitment approach to things, that actually we think that if we have a really robust recruitment process, actually will deter potential perpetrators. And some of that is true. Some of that we never know how many people we save people from through robust recruitment processes that just deter people. But there really is a thing about culture and leadership in organisations. And to just embed it in the UK context with a name that actually I think is in the media today in connection with Oxfam. So a little while ago, Jim Gamble, who I think is going to be the specialist advisor, I think, to Oxfam's commission, he was the chief executive of CEOP, the Child Exploitation Online Protection Centre, part of what is now the National Crime Agency. And he was the National Police Lead for Child Protection. Just as sort of Operation OR and this sort of explosion of indecent images of children so it started to hit public consciousness. And what was really interesting about Jim Gamble was you couldn't turn the television on without him saying, if you're doing this, we're going to knock on your door. We're coming after you. And if there's not a policeman's footprint on your door tomorrow morning, you got lucky, it'll probably be the next day. Well, actually, that really powerful message contrasts with where we are now, where the NCA, for example, are saying we have 50,000 IP addresses of people downloading indecent images, and we can't arrest our way out of this problem, is the message that's coming out. Now, that's changed more recently, and there's more arrests happening. But actually, if you contrast from an offender's point of view, we're coming to get you if you're doing this with, gosh, this is a really big public policy issue, and we can't arrest our way out of it. Actually, if you're in that process of deciding whether or not it's worth taking the next step, actually, which is going to encourage you to resist and which is going to encourage you to take the next step. And I think that same happens with organisations. How robustly we talk about these things, how confidently we talk about things. One of the things that surprises me a lot when you talk to people in the sector, actually, is the extent to which the language and vocabulary around some of this is quite challenging for people. I've sat in rooms with child protection specialists, and child protection in our sector very different to safeguarding, of course, where actually if you talk about sexual exploitation of children, people blush.
Right.
And you know,
it's a bit of a taboo topic.
Absolutely, it's a really challenging thing, and actually I think people need the vocabulary, and they need to be able to have the permission to talk about this, and the more confidently you talk about it, actually, the more likely you are to deter people.
Bring Marsha, because this is, you mentioned having these kind of frank conversations within UN peacekeepers.
Yeah, I mean, your last example is just really struck me. You know, if you think about agencies or offices within the UN that are responsible, for example, Child Protection Office section of a peacekeeping mission, of course they will have, hopefully they will have extensive knowledge about most of these practices, probably from a domestic and an international background. But, for example, there will be many programs rolled out in a peacekeeping mission where, say, an entire battalion will be distributing aid, essentially, to children. We don't know if there's an equivalent CRB check on any of those individuals. They are responsible for providing meals, for providing medical advice for children, and I mean, usually in the context of parents or some adult, but I mean, there's lots of situations where there is no safeguarding policy that's been set up. So there's lots of, you know, and again, those individuals may be, for example, going into IDP camps, you know, speaking with locals, talking with children who, I mean, the image of the peacekeeper, the most renowned image is the peacekeeper, you know, handing out sweets to small children. So I'm just giving that, I mean, of course there are issues too with adult beneficiaries as well. But maybe just two things that I could talk about, and hopefully they sort of answer several of those questions. But if they don't, and please approach me afterwards, and I'm not trying to squirm out of it, it's just there's been such a wide discussion. I was thinking about this issue about, actually much of the focus has been in the media and by the UN itself has been on military peacekeepers who actually have quite restricted mobility, although the cases in a way are easier to document. But actually civilian peacekeepers have a much greater discretionary power. And I think that's, if you just think about that on a practical level, those individuals will have access to a vehicle, that they, that they're responsible for. They will be living in accommodation by themselves. They will not be necessarily living in a group setting. So, I mean, one of the things that I've been asking the UN for is, can you correlate the number of allegations with this high level of discretionary power where people actually can, and there isn't really, it's sort of like, okay, the highest number of allegations are in this, peacekeeping mission with military personnel. So there isn't a kind of deep understanding of what's going on, which people don't abuse power in these situations, which peacekeepers are actually doing the right thing, if one could say that, what enables them not to do that. So I think that's a key element. And I think this issue of, just a recent example, which is that some peacekeeping militaries have enacted an internal policy, a kind of zero tolerance for sex. So what they've said is, nobody is allowed to have sex while they're on the mission with anybody at any time, just no sex, right? And this fits with their disciplinary practice of no fraternization, which is like, you can't socialize with the local population. I don't know how this is going to pan out. In a way, it's got its benefits, but I mean, again, you've got this problem of, you're going to have to, there are many different types of violences and other sexual practices going on. You cannot deal with all of them in the same way. Child abuse, a situation where an adult sex worker is involved with a local aid worker cannot be addressed with the same, the same mechanisms, or at least in the same way as a situation with, that we saw in Central African Republic and we've seen in Mali. So we definitely need to figure out, even if the policy is broad enough that it enables us to capture a lot of different things, we cannot, it's not the same for someone to have exploited children in an IDP camp or to have held parties.
So to really differentiate between
and then should we send a peacekeeper home if they've been involved with an adult versus shall we have criminal prosecution? So we need to just figure out the nuances of it. I'm not saying we shouldn't respond, but
I want to bring Shaista in, and I'm going to open up again for another round of questions.
First of all, I think we need to get real here, because this isn't all about so-called ambulance chases running into war zones to save the people there. We need to also acknowledge that here in the UK, Save the Children itself has, there's been extremely serious accusations made about 2 individuals who have since left. These things are happening inside headquarters in nice, gleaming European settings. They're not happening in refugee camp settings. We need to be clear about that. And as I said, the heart of this is patriarchy and power, and it's about cultures inside organisations that turn a blind eye to this frat boy culture which exists, where apparently if you've been out to visit a war-torn country, you're traumatised, therefore it's okay for you to do whatever you want. On the issue of consent, yes...
Shaista, on that one though, so in terms of organisational culture, how do you turn that around? What are the sort of practical... Because you talked a lot about representation.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about that just very quickly on consent. Okay, yes, you can have consensual sex, but there's an issue here about power. And power and consent cannot be separated. So, for example, these stories that have been coming out and the way they've been covered in the media is just shocking and disgraceful. Haitian women are trading sex. Now, if there's been one of the world's worst earthquakes and everybody's buried under the rubble, I really hazard a guess that if you are a woman trying to feed your children, and some of them might be under the rubble, probably the first thing on your mind isn't to trade sex, because you don't have any power to trade anything. You have no power in the situation. So this is the way all of this is being framed, and we need to kind of understand this is about patriarchy and power. In terms of the cultures, it's very straightforward. If people want to become senior managers or directors in organisations, they need to deal with the realities inside those organisations. They can't turn a blind eye to what's going on. I've worked in organisations where senior management have been known to be sleeping around, right? And it's just because it's deemed to be consensual that it's okay. It's not okay. This is a complete abuse of power. And there has to be very clear guidelines inside organisations that make it, crystal clear that this type of thing is not acceptable, because power operates in opaque ways, and it also operates in open ways, and usually they both blur. So we need to understand this. And also, frankly, I don't want to understand perpetrators. Perpetrators are there to exploit situations, okay? That's why they do what they do. They do what they do, be it here. Today, John Warboys, the black cab rapist, I mean, a group of victims and survivors had to go to the High Court to make sure the man wasn't released early. You know, those women had to do that. So even in countries like ours, where apparently there are laws to safeguard women against sexual predators, we know the system is failing. So we need to understand that I think there seems to be this sort of belief that there's a bit of mystery around how do we solve this. I don't think it's that mystifying. I think what we need to do is we need to apply the law in countries where there are laws against these things. If you are somebody who's going out to buy sex from children and from women, vulnerable women, or you're not even paying them for it, then you need to be prosecuted. It's as simple as that. This has been going on for a very, very long time. And the final thing I wanted to say is I think all of this actually kind of blends into the issue around aid itself. So yesterday, the Labour Party released their kind of policy for international aid, and at the heart of it is decolonising aid. It's reframing aid. Aid is not charity, it's not given to people. There has to be social justice attached to aid. And I think part of this whole Aid to movement, even if you don't believe it's a movement, is now actually, there's a whole chain of other questions that are now coming into this arena, and I think this is really, really important. So I think the women here in the UK who've made accusations are still waiting for justice. They're still waiting for answers from international aid organisations as to how individuals who they have accused of very serious things were given references to be allowed to continue with their great careers. So if we can't sort this out at this level, at HQ level, we don't have the ability to honestly say that we will sort it out elsewhere, because we set the tone and we set the agenda in these headquarters. And so it needs to start from here, and when we start from here, then what will happen? There will be it
sort of ricochets.
Yeah, it will ricochet through. So we've got to really get to the crux of this.
I know there's a lot of people with a lot more questions. I want to bring out another round of questions, and then I'm going to come back to our audience, our panel, for our last comments, so we can wrap up by 7. There's a lady's her hand up at the back here. Other questions? People want to show their hands? No, go on.
So I'm a former reporter, and also now I work with communications in nonprofit. I am from the south, from the field, and I've seen a lot of what you've all talking about, and I think you made very interesting points. But I have a very practical question and direct. You've seen this is a changing moment. This is going to be it, blah, blah, blah. As we speak now, lots of harassment and abuse are happening as we speak, and as you have had the experience of people still coming and talking to you. Do you see any chance of like a big cleanup coming right now, taking place right now? Like, let's just go there and like get these bad people out and let the other people, as you said, like the ones that who are there not gonna do anything ever, carry out the work. Because as you also said in this last round, without punishment, without showing that this has consequences, it's not going to solve the problem.
Is this any different to 2002 when Amrita was first doing her report? Thank you. Other thoughts? I'm not going to come back to our panel, perhaps in reverse order. So to answer this question, if there aren't signs that it's going to radically change, what could we do to make sure that it does?
Well, I think it has to. Bottom line is it has to change. As you said, we've had 17 years. We can't wait another 17 years. If anyone thinks this is going away, it's not going away. If anyone thinks that the survivors and the victims are going to disappear, they're not going to disappear. There's a lot of anger inside these organisations. People want answers, and I believe the good people in senior management also want answers. They're as desperate to clear this up and to change these cultures as much as those, individuals who've actually suffered are as well. So it has to change. It's as simple as that. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm a realist and an optimist as well. It's going to take a long time, but it cannot take 17 years. I think, as Helen says, these inquiries, the evidence that's been given and the evidence that will be given as well will definitely play a role in that. But I think it's up to everybody in this room and everyone outside of the room as well to ensure that this change does happen. It happens much quicker than, we don't have 17 years. And like I said, the only thing I definitely know is that this is not going away. victims are angry and they want justice and they want redress. And so my only genuine advice would be to anybody who works for one of these organisations is to get your house in order and to sort it out very, very quickly, because if you don't, then there will be outside pressure for you to do it, and it's not going to go away.
Thank you. Yeah, Marsha.
Yeah, how to really follow up. I think you've said so much. Maybe just to, I mean, this isn't actually in opposition to what you're saying and to what others have said. I think it's actually, worthwhile us talking about. I don't know, just to go back to that question around consent, because I think and the sexual rights of beneficiaries. And I think that actually, because if we focus only on the similarities amongst victims, and we don't look at organizational culture, and we don't look at the kind of wider social context, and we don't look at the colonial investments in the aid sector, if we're not attacking those, we will not be able to have these complex discussions. So I think there are lots of examples where we might say this is re-victimizing local people by not, by speaking on their behalf. So I think that and there are other situations where people cannot speak. They are literally, as Shaista says, they are completely powerless in those situations. So I don't want to say that, people in these contexts, beneficiaries in these contexts, are these wonderfully empowered individuals who choose to be involved in sex work, and there are cases where people are in those situations, but definitely I think so. I haven't made any headway with that, but just to say there's so many aspects to it, and I think in lots of situations I'm thinking the existence of the peacekeeping mission in Haiti, for example, has been extremely detrimental. Maybe sexual exploitation and abuse would continue from, before the mission has been there, but it would definitely take a different form. So I think that really decolonizing aid is one of the ways that we can...
and a practical manifestation of that decolonizing? Sort of...
Just a quick example from peacekeepers that I've spoken to in my research. Many of them tell me about programs that they have tried to put on, very small scale efforts that they've tried to engage the local community in. So, for example, a peacekeeper who has martial arts skills, who wants to put on a class for self-defense for local women and men in the community. Absolutely no support from the UN. It's not part of the mandate. It's not what peacekeepers are there for. Actively discouraging this peacekeeper from being in conversation. So, there's that's an example of this kind of like the bureaucracy of it. These people are in need of our aid, but these are the conditions in which this aid will be given, or this kind of intervention. So there's kind of there's a real arrogance about that needs to be challenged. And I don't know that, I'm not suggesting they should have self-defense classes put on.
Right, but finding these pockets.
An example of how the kind of overall ideology and structure can undermine the efforts. And I think, what Steve was saying about there's lots of individuals who do have good intentions and want to do things. Just one more example of a group of female peacekeepers who wanted to meet with local women. And they wanted to do it on their off-duty time. The news of this potential meeting went to the UN headquarters, panicked everybody. I don't know why there was a panic over this. They actually scheduled these female peacekeepers' duty so that they could not meet with these local women. This was supposed to be the work of the gender advisor, not individual, again, it goes around. And I just thought that was absolutely a no-cost event that, had the possibility of actually building solidarity with local women and also building solidarity amongst the few female peacekeepers. It's a real shame. And I think that much of that comes from this very steeped colonial attitude around, what the purpose of this mission is. And meeting those
and
objectives.
who defines it.
Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, I think to go to the point, I think we've seen a little bit of a clear out, by no means a full house, but actually most aid organisations, I'm willing to bet, have seen an increase in their internal reporting, whistleblowing as a result of this, and we can but hope that they're responding appropriately to those sorts of things. Certainly, I've received emails from staff members and former staff members reporting things that happened many, many years ago that they didn't feel comfortable to report then, and of course we're now unpicking how we chase some of those things down. I think the way in which I think the point about whether or not this disappears, this sort of moment, is absolutely critical, and I absolutely take the point about, this is everybody's responsibility here. I think there's a real difference on this occasion. I wasn't around in 2002, but the position that I'm seeing actually is that one of the reasons why some people find it difficult to speak out, amongst the whole plethora of sort of standard reasons about guilt and complicity and the culture of organisations and things, is this desire to support aid. So actually, we're in this febrile political position where actually, if you're faced with reporting something internally that you think won't get traction, and the risk is that actually it's then used by people whose a view of the world you fundamentally oppose, actually that's another encouragement to stay quiet. And one of the reasons why there's this febrile atmosphere is around some of the political conversations around aid, but also this idea that actually if you report too many figures, too many incident reports, people like DFID will cut your funding, or they won't give you funding. And actually what appears to be happening now is people like DFID, funders, donors in all sorts of different guises are speaking very positively about this, and that they're starting to seize the narrative around incident reporting, and actually no cases in a particular country or programme should be a big red flag. We should be running around panicking about the notion that there are whole countries in which development activity is taking place and nobody is reporting anything. There's not a single child abuse allegation, there's not a single concern about the safety of a beneficiary. And actually, I would like to think, I may be naive, and colleagues on the panel here have got much more experience in the sector than I have, that actually where the difference is that actually the peril for organisations about speaking out about the challenges here are reduced if donors actually are very clear about it.
Encouraging the donors to create an environment where the senior management of NGOs can actually speak up and say, we have this problem, and to be frank and to be rewarded to admitting to a problem, as opposed to being sort of encouraged to keep silent.
Absolutely, and I don't know enough about the internal Oxfam situation to comment, but what I can say is that people in the audience here who've worked at Oxfam, and actually my experience of the safeguarding team at Oxfam is that they're incredible people. They're really solid, professional people with great insight into some of these things. And there really is an interesting thing about what's happened in the run-up to some of these things, accepting all of the failings and the lessons that should be learned from that, and the accountability to which people should be held for those things. But some of the people who are trying the hardest find themselves in the crosshairs of some of this. And actually that's really challenging if you're one of the people, I represented some of the people on the panel who've been working for years on trying to resolve this. And because you've spoken out about those things, you find yourself in the crosshair, or your organisation finds itself in the crosshair.
Good segue to Helen.
Absolutely.
Talk about being in the crossfire of some of this over the years.
And I'd echo Steve's point. Within the safeguarding team within Oxfam, there is some incredibly committed and brave individuals. And the problem here is with senior management. So a lot of senior management have known about this, and they have silenced people, and they continue to silence people. And it's great that we have an independent commission that Oxfam has started. It's really important that we've got the IDC inquiry, and evidence will close, written evidence, on 6th of April, and then they will have their hearing. But then what next? Because if after all of this, the same people are in those senior management positions, then we have failed, because they have been part of the problem, and it is just inexcusable if they then continue in those positions, because we've talked about culture, and culture starts at the top. And there is a problem at culture at the top. And that was just evidenced in Safeguarding Summit when I was asking DFID and the Charity Commission, who's going to that Safeguarding Summit? It was mostly the chief executives, and most of the chief executives are white Western men. And this speaks very much to Shaisa's point. We need to have representative leadership. And until the leadership teams of the aid agencies represent the people that they're engaging with, then we are not, we can continue having a problem. And if we talk about decolonisation, that's where it starts. I worked in the private sector before I came to Oxfam. I was just really shocked how you'd go into a country programme, and this is not just Oxfam, this is across, you know, pretty much all the aid agencies that I was seeing. You would have a white Western country director and then very often national staff underneath, and the leadership team would be dominated by expatriates. Now, there's definitely been movements to change that, and progress has been made, but not anywhere near enough. It's nowhere near representative of the groups that aid agencies are actually working with. So that's a fundamental change that we need.
Thank you. Asmita.
Yes, I mean, coming back to the point that was made in the audience, you know, is there going to be a big clean-up? Certainly, I think this is a pivotal moment. You know, I regard this as kind of round two. I mean, round one was 2002, the first global scandal. And I wouldn't minimise, you know, the impact of that. I mean, it was actually hugely difficult for those of us who reported it. We faced huge challenges in doing it. And in bringing about even that high-level policy change, that was very, very difficult. And it was really largely down to a core set of key donors, led by the US government, no less, that even that level of change at the highest level was achieved. I think what's happened in the intervening years is that the eye has been taken off the ball, the agencies have been left to themselves, and, you know, they obviously have done some useful work in developing policies and so on and so forth, but the external scrutiny has completely been absent. You know, donor governments largely haven't been following up. Some may have adopted some policies in terms of giving grants or so on, but you know, that hasn't happened. There's been no media attention. There's been no public outcry. And for all of those factors to come together, you know, it takes a certain kind of confluence of factors to turn something into a global scandal. Just because we haven't heard anything for 16 years, that doesn't mean it hasn't been going on. I'm absolutely sure it's been going on year in, year out. There have been countless victims of this. But the problem has been that, you know, there's been no kind of scrutiny. And this is why I feel so strongly about an independent function, because what I'm suggesting is to try and institutionalise this process where donors in particular become aware that there are issues. Otherwise, we're relying on individual personalities, ad hoc factors, you know. First of all, you have people in-house who identify something and then are brave enough to raise it. Then you have an organisation that's resistant to change. Then you have somehow some media pick up of the story, then you have a public outcry, and then the donors respond. I mean, that's a very kind of ad hoc, random way to address this problem. We need an institutional mechanism where these issues can be raised in an ongoing way. So, and just a couple of other points to pick up on in terms of the anti-aid agenda. I mean, I was accused of that in 2002, so this is an ongoing. And frankly, as someone who, you know, has had to report these abuses and, you know, suffered for doing so, to be honest, I regard it as emotional blackmail. To be, you know, told that I'm undermining aid organisations or the development agenda by raising these issues. I believe in, you know, human rights and development, which is why I work in it, but I'm going to call it out wherever I see it. I'm not going to exempt aid agencies. In fact, they have a responsibility to help, you know, be held to even higher standards. And that's where, again, what everyone has said about breaking the culture of silence is absolutely critical. It is an organisational, cultural issue from top down. We saw it in West Africa too. There were issues with, you know, the leadership in certain organisations who were also at that time forced out of office for sexual harassment, who led on the response to the West Africa case. And so it permeates down the chain to eventually exploitation of beneficiaries on the ground. So yes, more transparency, more ownership by the sector of these issues and as a collective problem. I mean, if they spoke about this and dealt with it themselves, they could contextualise their challenges. They could explain why it's difficult to handle, rather than wait for, you know, media to kind of expose stories and then take them out of context.
Thank you very much. A very powerful case there with the external organisation. So it turns me to thank our panel. It's been a really, really excellent discussion. So please join me in thanking all of them for very, I think, profound insights and some very practical recommendations that have come out of it as well. So thank you very much.